Somaliland was Vichy, which is interesting, so they just kind of stayed on the side and went hungry. But what happened was January 19th, all these attacks started going in from all these different directions, and by the 5th of May, not 4 months later, Haile Selassie rides back into Addis Ababa. Ethiopia was the first Allied country conquered by the Axis that was liberated in the entire Second World War, and the British imperial victory with the Ethiopians and a few free Frenchmen and the Force Publique was the second Allied success against the Axis in the war up to that point, for all intents and purposes, in terms of big land battles. And that's pretty good. And then the Italians, they said, "We will return." This is more the reality. That's in Italian Somaliland. So this is truly a remarkable moment in history with remarkable people just across the board, with huge implications. Once AOI was conquered, FDR said, hey, it's no longer a war zone. U.S. merchant ships can go through the canal and go through the Red Sea. Huge boost to the British logistical setup for fighting their war, because it's just April and May, it was April of 41 when he did that. The thing is, though, to kind of put it in this perspective, though, is, yeah, there's Haile Selassie being restored to power. The war has 4 more years to go, and it hasn't even hit its worst. It hasn't even hit its worst stride yet. Barbarossa hasn't happened yet, and neither has Pearl Harbor. You know, there's a lot more to come. But that is the story of Africa Orientale Italia. Yes, question, please, in the back.
Yes, I just finished rereading Churchill's Gathering Storm.
Yes.
And I realized that Churchill, you know, was not about fudging facts.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Great men get that privilege. Yes.
Yeah. Some interesting points I remember from there. First of all, is that the reason why Ethiopia was in the League of Nations was that Italy had sponsored them.
Oh, I didn't know that, but
yeah, that's what he said. And the second thing he was saying was that this was part of what that the British opposition in the League of Nations had the dual to the invasion of Ethiopia had the dual fault of number one being ineffective because they put, you know, the old Western thing, we put sanctions on them.
Right. Yeah, but not oil. Yeah.
And you just made them mad. And that made them align more with Hitler than they would have before, and it didn't really stop them.
No, it was just sort of I understand the calculations, but it was a complete whiff. They completely missed it on that. Absolutely right. And eventually, if I'm not mistaken, Italy left the League of Nations over all this condemnation and all this tisk-tisking. They just up and left. Yeah, and that's just part of the story. Yes, please.
What was the reaction of the other European countries to the use of the mustard gas?
That's a really, really good question.
Did they use it on the British when they attacked British Somaliland?
No, they most decidedly did not. Because, well, there's two things. One, there was always, generally, and one reason why you don't see poison gas in World War II was it's just like, the other side, we do what the other side unleashes on us, and everybody had gas stockpiles, and just nobody wanted to be the one who pulled that trigger. We all had chemical weapons available, but no one ever got to the point of using, which was a good thing in the long run. But yeah, what happened was how the Italians deflected that was they said that we only used it after the Ethiopians committed war crimes. Okay, and basically they had 3 things they laid against the Ethiopians. One, Ethiopian soldiers were accused of using dum-dum bullets, which are basically an exploding head bullet that causes more grievous wounds. 2, they argued that, and war crimes in a war zone, that's kind of like speed tickets at Indy 500, you know. But then the second thing was, though, is they said that they mutilate and kill Eritrean and Somali Askaris, POWs, which was kind of true. And then the third one was, there was this case where there was this Italian aviator and his navigator, gunner, bombardier, they crash landed, and there's all sorts of stories about what happened, but they were basically caught and killed by the Ethiopians. And the question was, well, did they fight them to the end, or were they taken prisoner? And there were arguments that they were mutilated and tortured and blah, blah, blah. And the pilot became a big hero. In fact, there is still, no lie, there is still an airport down in Calabria that is named after this guy. He is seen as a war hero and a martyr. And so what happened was the Italian government said, yeah, the Ethiopians aren't playing fair, neither will we, and that was that. Then the second thing is also, though, the reality of it was that long before a lot of these war crimes or atrocities were being brought up, there was actually, as the Bono was starting to stall out and the Ethiopians were really giving the Italians a hell of a time, what happened was they got it on record. There was a communique from Mussolini saying you can use poison gas as a last resort. Well, whatever that means to a general in the field, right? And so that's what happened. But yeah, it's just sort of like, do it now and explain it or apologize or forget it later kind of thing is what it came down to. But no, there are a lot of people like, that's just appalling, you know, and especially anybody who was a veteran of World War I or the Great War, and they remember how bad it was to deal with, you know, but you know, it really is, you should look at it, it's just like when it's without the gas, the casualties are basically almost equal, and once they started employing poison gas, it's 10 to 1 in favor of the Italians.
The Europeans thought if they used it against Africans, it would be a little bit less.
Well, there was certainly, you know, you could certainly add a racialist element to that. There's no doubt about it. But the reality of it is that I think that the thing was that it's all part of that whole big story of, well, how are we going to get the Italians to stop? Well, you can go to war with, or maybe really crippling sanctions. But you know the British even, you know, as the Italians were building up in the spring and summer of *35, the British actually took their elements of the Royal Navy and pulled them out of the Med, just to not antagonize the Italians. And the weird thing is Victor Emmanuel III, who was still king, and has the power to dismiss Mussolini, he had a huge and healthy respect for the Royal Navy. And when the Royal Navy backed down, he's like, oh yeah, let's do this. Yeah, I get the whole idea about selfish, dishonorable cowardice, but it'll always come back to make you pay. There's always a bigger price. When you embrace those things, you're going to pay a bigger price before it's all done. Dan?
Yeah, so real quick, Cyril, just what you were saying there. 1-to-1 casualties roughly. It was the even fight.
Yeah.
If, again, I hate what ifs, but if they had not used mustard gas,
they probably would have done. It probably would have ground down to a stalemate, and then who knows what would have happened. You know, how long would the Italians support it if it was just this grinding, like a cap, you know, Isonzo front kind of thing, yeah, like a World War I battle. Yes, it would not so well in Peoria or Apulia. Yes, sir. Question?
Was there any natural resources in Ethiopia that everybody wanted?
No, not really. There was decent agriculture. There was great coffee. But at this time, no. It was mostly geopolitical. It was like we want an empire. We want a place for colonists. We want a place in the sun. There was the idea that, you know, if we make all this, they didn't really get to it. But the Italian. That port up in Eritrea called Massawa is actually a magnificent harbor. It's a magnificent port, and it's right there on the African side of the Red Sea. And when the war came in 1940, they had a handful of destroyers and a handful of mine layers and some submarines. You know, the British had battleships and stuff like that, and heavy cruisers. And so, you know, one of the things was that now it's more of a strategic location that if the Italians had maybe had their way, and they had plans Oh, I read where they were like, oh, we'll put an aircraft carrier down there. Well, maybe you should build one first, you know. But they were going to like turn that into like their own little Toulon or you know, or was it Toronto? It would be a second Toronto, but they never got a chance. And so when the war came, the Navy was almost as ineffective as the Army. It just, the one part where they did really well was the Air Force, because a lot of those pilots, even though they weren't flying first line craft, were veterans of the Spanish Civil War, and they knew how to shoot down enemy planes, even in a obsolescent aircraft. They were dangerous. They were very good at what they did and very dedicated. But the Army kind of went inert, and the Navy was just sort of overwhelmed and intimidated. And eventually they had one of those things where they had like a death ride, like these 3 destroyers. Well, we're going to go out and shoot all the torpedoes and guns, and we're going to run aground somewhere. And it's just like, yikes. There's got to be a better way than that. Yeah. Anybody else? Any other questions? Oh, yes, please, sir.
Seeing these pictures of Haile Selassie reminds me of some pictures my dad brought home from Korea, 68, 69.
Thank you for coming.
Ethiopian army actually participated in the war, and Haile Selassie was there for the dedication of the monument to the Ethiopians that lost their lives in the Korean War.
Oh yeah, the Ethiopian contingent in the Korean War were just crack troops, and they were part of I think they were part of the Kipur Sadanga, if I'm not mistaken. But they were very effective, and they definitely paid on a lot of Norkies and Chi-Coms, and they're okay in my book. So, for sure. Anybody else? Richard. Oh, I'm sorry. Rick first. Rick and Richard. Rick.
What was the British coming in from all these different directions at one time?
Exactly. Every company.
How did the Italians not know this was coming?
Well, the reality of it was they, that is a really good question. Maybe they disposed, one of the things was, that's a good question. A lot of the places over the Italians went turtle were mountains, fortified mountains with mountains of supply. In fact, there was one place in the north center part of Ethiopia called Keren, K-E-R-E-N. It's a place where all the women go to talk to the manager. No, so it's called Keren. And that stood up against the Commonwealth troops, the Imperial troops, for 2 months. And they were heavily outnumbered. I mean, you know, and they just fought and fought and fought. There was one British soldier, and he said, I fought the Italians at Keren, I fought the Germans at Monte Cassino, and the Italians at Keren fought harder. Okay? But what happened was still, over time, every one of those mountain fastnesses fell. One way, it fell to the Gideon force, it fell to the force Publi, it fell to the British, and then the British got control of the air, and the bottom line was, and then of course, you know, the British made sure the newspapers got to tell the Italians, you lost Libya, you know, that kind of stuff too. Not that they're not going to tell them that Rommel showed up and ruined everybody's parade, but they're going to let them know that they lost Libya. And so the morale and the sort of just that sinking feeling, and surrounded and pounded from the air, and eventually they just all start following one after the other. Yeah. Richard.
And contemporaneous with Ethiopia falling to the British, that was just about the same time as Rommel was beginning his first attack out of Cyrenaica.
In May of 41, that's exactly right.
Toward the Libyan Egyptian border.
Yeah, so, but like I said, those newspapers were not going to get through to the Italians. but the British ones all, but Operation Compass sure did.
If there are any further questions, I'm going to ask you to just stay afterwards to talk to the doctor, and I'm going to interrupt here. Just
please.
And thank you so much for such an enlightening talk.